Once the inflatable had finally moved away to a safe distance, the U-boat's conning tower had gently begun to slip down, eventually disappearing from sight beneath the calm and glassy waters. Pausing for a moment or two for comedic effect, Schmidt smiled wryly to himself, before announcing it would likely be a long swim home now, for any man who wanted to withdraw from the mission. His observation had been received in exactly the manner in which it had been intended, rewarded with a muted chorus of approval from the other three occupants of the dinghy. As he had expected, the most enthusiastic of said endorsements had come from the hulking figure of Stier, wedged in hard, directly in the centre of the tiny craft. The boat's oarsman was both well liked and feared by his peers in equal measure, the clear deficiencies in his intellect providing a stark contrast to his gigantic physique. Whatever the former boxer's real name may have been, it had now long since been forgotten, due to his childlike insistence of being addressed by his long-standing bovine nickname. As he had been waiting to step down from the submarine's deck, Schmidt had turned to offer a parting wave to the vessel's commanding officer. In doing so, he had noted the open disapproval with which the naval officer had regarded the civilian clothing that he and his team had elected to wear for the trip. At several points during their passage under the North Sea, Captain Lieutenant Gruner had gone to great pains to point out the dangers of this course of action. Were they to be captured by the British, they would likely be treated as spies rather than soldiers, facing execution as opposed to imprisonment. But much like the majority of his fellow Brandenburgers, Billy Schmidt had not been selected for any overwhelming love or loyalty to his homeland. In truth, he did not truly regard himself as a soldier. He was here purely because in the grand scheme of things, it was far better than the alternative. Prior to the declaration of hostilities, he had been a founding member of one of the leading crime gangs in his native Dresden. But that life had come to an end following the intervention of a particularly diligent police inspector, who had made it his business to curtail the activities of both Billy and his associates. It had been the aftermath of Schmidt's trial, whilst awaiting the inevitable prison sentence that must surely follow. He was visited by his future commanding officer. In addition to his broad range of criminal skills, the fact Schmidt was completely fluent in the language of his British mother had been the factor which had pushed him to the top of the Major's list of potential candidates. Having avoided imprisonment, much to the chagrin of the local police department, he had soon been able to persuade his new employer to secure the release of two more of his associates. In the case of his childhood friend, this had proven relatively easy, largely due to him and his family having helped Heinz Vogel learn English whilst they were at school together. Obtaining freedom for Rudy Fischer, though, had been more difficult, with the hapless gang member displaying neither the interest nor talent to learn a foreign language. Eventually, though, after some persuasion, the army had ordered the former explosives expert be taken to a local testing range in order to demonstrate his talents. The resultant pyrotechnic display had been an unqualified success, with the addition of the hulking Stier to the group, creating a new skill set that pleased their new masters and was soon eager to put to good use. Clandestine operations in Holland and Yugoslavia would follow, the quartet's underhand techniques securing key transport routes and supplies ahead of the invading infantry battalions. But the celebrations that followed these missions had long since passed. Having expended both their wages and spoils of war they had seized during these antics, they were here now, cramped into a rubber boat in the middle of the night, with virtually no idea what dangers awaited them on the foreboding Scottish coastline. Emerging from the object into the looming darkness of the hangar, Brudenell's mind didn't register the suit's blaring warnings until it was too late. Before he could act, his legs had unexpectedly buckled beneath him, sending the pilot crashing down onto the cold concrete that awaited him below. but within moments, the reassuring figure of Flight Sergeant Dunn was alongside him, whispering words of encouragement, whilst helping to haul him back up to his feet. Predictably, the fall had not resulted in any injury, the suit having instinctively altered its composition to reinforce those external areas that were about to make contact with the floor. The Yorkshireman had been gently walking him forwards when there was a sudden eruption of noise that had come echoing across from the far side of the vast enclosure. It had not taken much guesswork for Brudenell to correctly guess the source of the approaching disturbance before his suspicions were confirmed to him by the suit's sensors. With one index finger wagging in an accusatory manner, his voice almost at a scream, Colonel Alexander had emerged from the shadows at the outer edges of the hangar, shouting at the hapless Brudenell, berating him for having allowed one of the Eni bombers to escape the carnage, much as he had done with the lone Messerschmitt on the other mission several weeks before. Even with Dunn's strained efforts to keep him standing upright in the face of this verbal attack, Brudenell could feel his legs once again beginning to buckle beneath him. A sudden and unexpected shot of adrenaline from the suit easily resolved his physical issue, but did little to improve the beleaguered pilot's mental acuity. Undeterred, the base commander had continued his attack, bluntly reminding the young pilot of the risk not only to himself, but to everybody else on the airfield. If the Germans were to discover their location, they would likely deploy every conceivable resource they possessed to take control of the unearthly craft that the pilot was standing alongside. Attempting to offer what came across as mumbled and incoherent responses, Brudenell grimly noted that the result to pacify the colonel had only incensed him further. It was only when Dunn motioned for several other men to come and assist in escorting the pilot officer to the infirmary there was any let-up. The overwhelming and irrational anger that had consumed their commanding officer finally giving way to complete exasperation. Sinking down into the wheelchair that had now been placed beneath him, Charlie Brudenell again muttered his thanks to the NCO before closing his eyes and pretending to drift away into unconsciousness. But as ever, he experienced no comfort. The hell that had possessed him months before, continuing to deny him any glimmer of respite. Interspersed with the persistent squeak of every rotation of the wheelchair's wheels and the hushed chatter of the men walking alongside him, there was another sound, a noise barely distinguishable amongst the louder ones it was hidden amongst, save only to the man who had grown to fear its presence. When it had first started, several weeks before, it had been little more than a whisper. Similar in nature to the distant calls of a gull above the shoreline, or the horn of a fishing vessel deep in the morning fog, far away from the land it passed. But now, with every passing day, it was growing akin to the deafening explosion that had nearly claimed his life as he had desperately escaped his doomed aircraft months before. A chorus of voices, neither male nor female, speaking a language he could not understand, rendered into comprehension by the suit they had constructed, in which he now resided, telling him not to worry, that they were closer than ever to finding him, and that soon, overcoming all odds, they would be there to retrieve him. For men who had spent their lives evolving methods of entering places they had no right to be, the reinforced fencing of the English airbase had proven disappointingly easy to negotiate. With a few brief applications of the wire cutter, the German team had quickly been inside, Schmidt watching on with satisfaction as Vogel had readjusted the damaged area in order to mask any trace of their passing. Immediately after this, the Brandenburgers had gone to ground, cautiously scanning their surroundings with their binoculars to establish the strength and routine of the forces that had been amassed to stop them. Within a few short minutes, it had become abundantly clear that the odds they faced were stacked somewhat dramatically in their favour. What few troops had been assigned to that evening sentry duty were stood out in the open, in huddled groups, sharing stories and cigarettes. Likewise, the two armoured cars that perhaps posed the greatest threat to the invaders were parked up in the centre of the main runway, their machine guns pointing aimlessly off in the direction they'd been abandoned. Without a word, The quartet had hurriedly made their way across to the nearest building, immersing themselves in the shadows, cautiously waiting to see if their movements had been noticed. For several minutes, they listened on, as the distant traces of laughter and conversation drifted aimlessly across the open spaces around them, confirming their presence remained undetected. Whilst the others knelt alongside him, hands gripping tightly to their weapons, Schmidt had continued to scan their surroundings until he finally found what he had been searching for. There, stacked up alongside a row of waiting fighter aircraft, were several piles of what appeared to be ammunition containers, arranged in readiness to be unloaded at some future point. Motioning for the others to come close, he spoke in hushed tones, confirming that Fisher knew what was expected of him and that Stier was to ensure no harm came to the explosives expert. Now satisfied his orders were understood, Schmidt took both men firmly by the hand, reaching out to squeeze their shoulders reassuringly as he did so. Several minutes later, the pair were on their way, stealthily moving across the airfield's open ground towards the waiting mountain of wooden crates. Then, with a nod of his head, he slowly stepped backwards, fully enveloped by the shadows that surrounded the hangar, Vogel reciprocating the movement alongside him. Dunn watched on as the doctor methodically examined Brudenell after he had been carefully deposited on top of the waiting gurney. Both he and Owens were fully aware the mysterious operating mechanism which had attached itself to the young pilot prevented him from sleeping, in the truest sense of the word. But continuing the charade that they had evolved over the previous few months seemed to somehow soothe the troubled youth, providing him with fleeting moments that resembled something close to normality. As ever, the look the doctor had offered the inquiring Dunn had been as hopeful as it was helpless. There was precious little they could do for the pilot, beyond offering their compassion and support. Conscious they were in company, neither man commented on the message they had managed to dispatch from the base to their superiors regarding their concerns for their patient, or the apparent lack of response. By now reassured there was little more to be done, the NCO thanked the medical officer before motioning for the men who had assisted him to leave. As they'd walked away from the infirmary, there had been a few passing attempts at conversation between the small group. But in truth, few of the people attached to this project felt comfortable enough to completely lower their defences around one another. Crossing the runway, Dunn noted with some annoyance that his unit's 2 Dingo armoured cars stood unattended, apparently yet again discarded by the men who should have been manning them. Bidding a goodbye to the others, he spent the next few minutes locating and rounding up the miscreants, snatching the cigarettes from their mouths and making a number of veiled threats with the situation to repeat itself. The flight sergeant was only too aware of how difficult it was to keep the men under his command motivated to carry out their assigned tasks. This airbase had been deliberately selected due to its isolated nature. The airmen posted there refused leave in order to maintain the secrecy needed to keep this project from the prying eyes of the enemy. And alongside the crushing boredom and loneliness they experienced on a daily basis, there was also no small degree of fear and apprehension, not only towards the mysterious object they'd been allocated to guard, but also towards their commanding officer, a man prone to daily fits of rage and anger. It was as he'd been making his way across to the sergeant's mess, Dunn's keen eye now fell on the unattended doorway of Hangar 4. Feeling himself falling into the grip of a deep exasperation, the NCO turned on his heel, his pace unbroken as he made his way directly over to the building in search of the missing sentry. After calling out a few times and satisfying himself the culprit was not within earshot, Dunn pushed open the door and began to search the building's interior. It was inside here, as he had moved from room to room in search of the absent airman, that the sergeant's world had then instantly and inexplicably faded to black. When Edward Dunn came to, the room he found himself in was dark, illuminated only by what little glow was filtering through the blinds from the lighting outside. Swivelling his head this way and that, with the realization he was both bound and gagged, he was disheartened to find the missing sentry and another airman both seated alongside him in a similar predicament. Frustratedly working his hands in a failed effort to loosen the ropes that secured them, Dunn then turned his attention to their captors, one of whom stood peering intently out across the airfield through the window blinds. Both were dressed in civilian clothing, neither carrying themselves with a particularly military gait, but when the one who was seated across the room from him spoke, the slight trace of an accent seemed to confirm their identities. The German's words were calm, matter of fact. The sergeant would lead them to wherever the object that operated out of this base was kept, or the men either side of him would die. His subsequent reaction to Dunn's defiant shake of the head was swift and brutal, a knife materialising as he crossed the room, before its blade was buried deep down into the leg of the airman to the sergeant's right-hand side. Barely had the soldier's muffled screams erupted from beneath his gag when the blade was now up at his throat, the weapon's holder not taking his eyes off Dunn throughout the manoeuvre, indifferent to his actions. Taking in the airman's terrified and pleading stare, Dunn's head sank down in surrender, his mind substituting the lad's terrified features for that of his own teenage son. Minutes later, the NCO was untied, watching on mutely as his captor donned the beret and greatcoat of one of the other prisoners, before indicating with his pistol for Dunn to move out of the room. Leaving Vogel to guard the remaining two airmen, Billy Schmidt then followed Dunn out into the corridor, only to suddenly motion for his prisoner to stop. Pausing for a few moments, he demanded to know the cause of the acrid and burning smell, which seemed to be emanating from further inside the building they were stood in. Turning wordlessly, Dunn began to walk further along the corridor, Schmidt falling in step behind him, slipping the pistol back into the greatcoat pocket as he did so. The hangar that the British soldier led him into was filled with the choking scent of singed wood and burning rubber, all of which was flowing from a wealth of wrecked vehicles and scale models that lay scattered around its interior. As he played his torch across the charred and melted entry points that punctuated the aircraft hulks and vehicle shells, Schmidt was amazed at how easily the exteriors of the various targets had been punched through. He demanded to know what had caused such symmetrical, devastating damage, but was met with silence. But by now, the German had caught sight of something else of interest. There, on the far side of the shadowy hangar, a bright light shone out from underneath the closed door, in complete opposition to the rest of their darkened environment. Closing the door behind him, Schmidt quietly regarded their new surroundings, which were clearly some form of mortuary or operating room. A series of metal cabinet doors were built into the far wall, with several empty gurneys pushed discarded against them. At first, Dunn refused the order to walk across the room and open one, but promptly relented as the German's pistol was once again produced. When he pulled back the crisp white sheet that covered the corpse inside, Schmidt groaned reflexively. The horror etched across the face of the young man that lay there, something he knew he would take to his grave. Most of the right-hand side of the lad's ribcage and torso were missing, almost as if they had been burned or melted away, most likely as the poor lad had still been alive, if his anguished features were anything to go by. With a low growl, Schmidt motioned for the rest of the cabinets to be opened, noting the similarly contorted facial expressions on the bodies that lay inside. Each and every one had a section of their remains that were now missing, the skin around the affected areas blistered and cauterized, as if exposed to extreme heats. Swearing loudly, Schmidt struck the NCO hard across the face with the pistol, levelling it at the man's forehead, demanding to know the identity of those who lay around him. He watched on, as tears formed in his prisoner's eyes, seeing nothing but truth in the British soldier's protestations that he did not know who they were or where they had come from. It took no small amount of effort for Schmidt to suppress the desire to vomit as he motioned for Dunn to close the cabinets, a toxic mixture of saliva and bile rising up deep from within his throat. Finally, once the grim task was completed, he fixed the sheepish Englishman with a pointed stare, demanding to be taken to whatever had wrought such death and destruction. Minutes later, the pair were walking in step through the cold night air, across the airfield towards an identical hangar on the opposite side of the runway. There were few men around, save for a couple of bored sentries who exchanged pleasantries with Dunn as their paths crossed, none bothering to even inquire about his disguised companion. Fully aware the rest of his team would still be concealed in the vicinity, watching closely, Schmidt gave the agreed hand signal that everything was in order. His two companions were indeed following his progress keenly from the shadows, Stier breathing a deep sigh of relief as their leader indicated all was going to plan. And then, as he and Fisher continued to watch, Schmidt and the British prisoner disappeared from sight into the darkness of the looming hangar. Having successfully gained entry to the room where his goal lay hidden, Schmidt cautiously approached the object, reaching out to run a hand across its smooth surface. It was cold to the touch, but beyond that yielded little more information than its strange and alien appearance. No external features were apparent that might belie the great power it concealed. After further prompting, Dunn explained how its propulsion and weapon systems were generated from inside the exterior, how without the inclusion of the pilot and his suit, this was little more than a large deposit of alien metal. On his cot in the infirmary, Brudenell was by now sat bolt upright, listening to every word of the conversation via the feed being forwarded to the suit from the object. For a few minutes, he desperately tried to evaluate what was taking place, how much danger the flight sergeant was in, and what he could do to assist. Noticing what was going on, one of the guards stationed outside the room had by now entered to inquire if there was a problem. Within minutes, sirens were sounding across the airbase, men tumbling from their cots and running for their rifles, the engines on the two Dingo scout cars on the runway roaring into life. As Schmidt wheeled round, the doors to the hangar burst open, Colonel Alexander striding triumphantly into the room, a pistol brandished in one hand, with guards either side of him, and Brudenell walking sheepishly behind. Waving Dunn away from the object with a suitably stinging rebuke, Alexander stared into the eyes of his prisoner, visibly disgusted by what he saw. He demanded to know the German spy's plan to remove the object, how large the rest of his team was, how they planned to escape. With a broad grin, Schmidt replied in perfect English, telling the officer to go fuck himself, the clarity and delivery of the words stunning the army officer. A heartbeat later, there was a thunderous explosion outside, punctuated by a series of smaller detonations as the planes lined up next to the burning ammo dump also ignited. The British soldiers were still looking around themselves in confusion as the doors behind them now burst open, Stier and Fisher cutting down several of their number with a volley of accurate gunfire. Before Alexander could react, Schmidt was on him, administering a swift knee to the groin and seizing his sidearm, before pushing the barrel of the pistol up into the small of the officer's chin and pulling the trigger. Clasping his hands to his ears, a seemingly pointless exercise given that the suit had automatically minimised the definite gunfire sounding around him, Brudenell sank down to his knees. The young pilot could feel the machine kicking into life behind him, channeling power to its weapon systems, glowing white hot as it sequentially identified the series of targets to be fired upon. Desperately fighting back in a bid to refuse the commands, he instead watched on as yet more of the RAF men fell to the machine gun fire peppering their ranks. The poor lighting inside the hangar which had initially shrouded them was now melting away as the craft glowed ever more vigorously behind him, making the British easier targets for their attackers. Alexander lay several feet away, eyes wide open, staring directly at him, the officer's fixed gaze seeming to accuse him of failure, even in death. He could also see Dunn, propped up against a crate of diagnostic equipment, blood pouring from a large wound that had been punched into his shoulder. The lead German was crouched low beside the NCO, silently surveying the battle that played out around him, seemingly searching for a way to escape this carnage. There was a further unexpected detonation outside the hangar, so violent in nature it temporarily paused the assault by the attackers stood at the door. Taking advantage of the lull, several of the airmen now returned fire, one of their rounds striking the torso of the bigger of the two Germans that stood there. The hulking figure cried out, wheeling around, the machine gun he held firing wildly around the hangar, one of its rounds ricocheting harmlessly off the exterior of Brudenell's suit. Instantaneously, the object overrode his objections, a beam of energy erupting forth, travelling across the hangar, vaporising the big German. Screaming a primal roar of pain and frustration, Brudenell now began to claw desperately at his chest, digging his fingers in hard at the material, levering and working at the suit, willing it to finally be gone from him. One moment, Stier had been standing there, swearing and trying to shrug off the bloody injury he had just sustained to his chest. The next second he was gone, a soot-covered shadow, all that remained to suggest he had ever existed. Fischer stood alongside it, staring in horror. It was Vogel who managed to free the explosives man from his stupor, shaking him hard by the shoulders as he materialised alongside him. As the two men again opened fire on the airfield's defenders, Schmidt rose now, turning to face the machine and the figure that cowered before it. The English pilot was knelt down on the cold concrete floor, tearing and rending at the suit he wore. By now, it appeared his efforts had been rewarded, a small patch of the dirty blue uniform beneath its exterior having been partially revealed. Gripping the pistol tightly in one hand, the Brandenburger advanced on the struggling figure, raising his weapon to deliver a kill shot. If he and the rest of his team could not take the machine, then better to deny the enemy their ability to operate it for themselves. But as he neared the pilot, another yellowy beam of energy lanced out of the craft, missing him by mere centimetres as it instead tore straight through a section of hangar wall. Ever so slowly, the black covering around the pilot's head receded a degree, exposing tortured and youthful features that lay beneath it. Brudenell fought with every fibre of his being to expose his face and chest as he continued to misdirect the blasts coming from the machine that tried to protect him. Fixing the German with a pleading look, he begged for the man to fire, to free him from the torment that robbed him of any future. Schmidt took one look at the object, which was by now glowing brightly as if white hot, and then back to the desperate and begging look on the face of the boy before him. The whole hangar was illuminated now by the blinding light that came from the craft, Englishmen and German alike shielding their eyes, trying to follow what was transpiring. Remembering the vision of his friend, disintegrating under the energy blast from the thing, and staring into the eyes of the boy it had imprisoned in order to do its work, the commando took aim and fired. All at once, the light from the craft ceased, plunging the hangar back into darkness. Taking a step forward, Schmidt bent down, inspecting the boy's body. In the half-light, it was almost as if the suit was moving and crawling around the body that lay beneath it. Then suddenly, a dark shadow seemed to rear up from it, surging forward towards him. And then there was darkness. Groaning softly to himself as he regained his senses, Schmidt realised he was now moving. Not of his own accord, but being carried on the shoulders of another. Opening his eyes, he mumbled in confusion, unable to detect anything other than inky blackness. His protest prompting the man who was carrying him to set him down, offering words of reassurance. When his vision did return, it was odd and deeply unnatural. Vogel's features swimming into focus, but framed by a series of unearthly numbers and words that made little sense. Looking down at his hands and legs, he realised what had occurred. The suit was now attached to him, just as it had been to the British pilot he'd killed. Vogel was shouting now, urging him to his feet. They were not far from the beach, but the base's defenders had rallied and would be upon them at any minute. With a nod, Schmidt rose, acknowledging Fischer's shout of encouragement, and then started to run. To his amazement, as he did so, he found he could still see the inside of the hangar, as well as the bodies lying inside it. There was the sound of vehicle engines, and the words swimming across his vision suddenly translated into wireframe outlines of the two British armoured cars setting off in pursuit. Shouting at the others, Schmidt warned them of the threat, ordering Vogel to fire the flare to alert the U-boat of their intent to escape. And then they ran, as hard and fast as they could, the skies erupting in an eerie red light as the flare exploded above them. Tripling and stumbling over gorse and heather, they made for the beach, spotting the conning tower of the submarine surfacing a short distance away, in the moonlight. But as the crew of U-21 began to spill out onto deck, hurrying to ready their gun, Schmidt was suddenly lifted high off his feet and hurled into the air. Rolling onto his side, as the ringing noise from the shell detonation began to subside around him, he found himself staring into the dead eyes of Heinz Vogel, his childhood friend, now lying alongside him, what remained of his lower body splintered and shattered into a red, pulpy mess. With a guttural cry, Billy Schmidt reached out to take his friend's hand, his thoughts and feeling utterly mangled by the knowledge he could do nothing more for the dead man than hold him, and then the whole world seemed to end around him. Commander Gruner had been shouting orders for the ship's boat to be launched, whilst the men readying the deck gun had started to pivot it round towards the shore, when the armoured car had appeared on the beach. Seconds later, the vehicle's turret had opened fire, a shell falling right amongst the trio of figures that were fleeing ahead of it towards the shoreline. Snatching up his binoculars, the sub-captain could now see that two of the prone figures were beginning to move again, the third apparently torn in two by the explosion. As the faintest trace of an agonised cry floated out across the water towards his vessel, the skies behind the beach were suddenly illuminated by a huge eruption of light and flame. Across the deck of the U-boat, the crew froze at their posts, watching on as a glowing yellow object rose slowly up into the sky, raining death and destruction down onto the ground below it. The horizon was lit up by multiple explosions as the aircraft and buildings of the RAF base began to detonate beneath a hail of energy blasts. Screaming to be heard above the destruction, Gruner managed to get the dinghy away and heading for the shore, and gave orders for the deck gun to open fire. But seconds later, their intended target was already a melted and smoking pile of steel, followed in quick succession by the second armoured car, which had appeared behind it. There was a grisly new sound now, mixed in with the dull thump of detonating ammunition, the mournful groans and screams of the dying, as those still alive in the airbase cried out for salvation. Gruner raised his binoculars again, watching as the two survivors were bundled back into the lifeboat at the shore, the vessel's crew immediately and frantically pulling away, back for the safety of the submarine. They need not have rushed. There were no aircraft left to attack them, and of the few RAF personnel who still lived, none possessed the courage to pursue. He watched on as the two Brandenburgers were heaved back on deck, initially believing that one had suffered catastrophic burns due to his blackened appearance. Clambering down from the control tower, he demanded to know what had taken place, his eyes widening as Fisher had tried to explain. Shifting his gaze from the sobbing figure in the black suit to the glowing object that had now assumed position in the sky directly above them, Gruner ordered the two men to be taken below. Minutes later, U-21 swung round and began to head back out into the North Sea, the new star that shone in the skies above them silently following on in their wake.